hot take. You have great taste, and I want to hear more about it, because my favorite things are passionate people. Review aggregates and social media focus on the wrong things, with boring likes and rating scores. These are too simple, and they're missing all the meat and juice. Give me some interesting adjectives. I want to know everything you're feeling, and then I can infer how much you like the thing, just based on how you're talking about it. The danger is that once you name something, you tend to stop looking at it. Discussion is framed around these mismatching numbers on these undefined scales, rather than focusing on the areas that we actually care about and keeping those frames in constant focus. Playing the comparison game is more fun than winning the comparison game. If you're bad at it, and let's be honest, we all start out bad at things, especially me, constant comparison can feel like a never-ending teardown. And if you only are degrading, you become the... But at the same time, if you blunt your senses and don't ever sink your teeth into anything with any degree of criticism, you're shielding yourself from being understood. The game is to weave your conflicting opinions with other people's conflicting opinions, creating this secondary work where your, plural, perspectives, also plural, are given the light. There is never just one way of ranking. To get stuck on a single hierarchy is to miss the bigger picture, the messy truth. Good is taken for granted, but better is worth the effort. So here's some frames I like to use when I'm comparing games. To be both pretentious and reductive at the same time, these are just multi-dimensional tier lists without necessarily taking the time to actually label top or bottom tiers, because I think the importance is that everything is relative. So my first lens is that of cost, time and money. This is the most negative frame, and here's my general zone. I prefer shorter, cheaper games. Second lens is that of motor. This is your coordination, your reflexes, the interfacing. So after cost, this is the other half of the answer to the question, can you play this game? And beyond ability, the question of, is it fun to play this game? Obviously, there's caveats for not just genre, but intensity of the game. Everything's got a parry mechanic now, you know? And you never know when a developer has a new way that they want you to interact with a camera or your perspective. And again, to disclose my biases, I'm very, very addicted to fighting games. So understand my threshold for frustrating is something very different than maybe an average person. I dislike it if things are unresponsive or confusing, but punishing is still somewhat within my tolerable zone, you know. Presentation. This is the immediately subjective area. Everything you see about the style, the artistry, the sound design. I value novelty as much as execution. For example, I think Psychonauts as a series is a great way to show what I mean. The original, it had extremely high novelty, a little lower execution, whereas the sequel, building on the same ideas, decreases in novelty, but across the board is a better executed game. In addition, I think pixel art is one of my favorite styles because the execution continues to grow exponentially, and realism kind of just gets no attention for me, no positive attention, I should say. Because the comparison to reality is constantly present. So if there's no style inserted, I'm constantly saying that it's way too familiar and is constantly going to be executed less than perfectly. It's not for me, not my cup of tea. And finally, persistence. This is the long-term subjective. This is only after you finish playing. Completion is not necessarily one of my values, but this is what you feel in your bones after you stop playing. Be it a day later, month later, years later. Funnily enough, I can't actually imagine a neutral, highly memorable game, something you remember but don't feel very strongly about. I'm using this y-axis between positive and negative as admittedly a flattened metric. This relationship you have with the amount of time after you've played a game is maybe hard to represent on an axis like this. Forgive me for flattening a time axis. Let's start by discussing some games that I theoretically could suggest to anyone, but would suggest to specific people for more nuanced reasons. These are two very, very interesting games for their style alone. Gris and Neva, developed by Studio Nemada, are these really compact, concise stories about beautifully rendered women in even more beautifully rendered worlds, overcoming these greater forces of darkness. It's your classical adventure story drawn in just gorgeous, gorgeous styles. Gris is this very simple game, but it is carried so hard by its amazing watercolor representation and allegorical transformation of the stages of grief. As you start in this crumbling, completely desaturated world, you are beset with these images of grief, both literal and metaphorical. I can't overstate how impressive the animation is. This game diegetically drips color diametrically opposed to an inky antagonist. The conflict is so visually tactile that without text it lands extremely potently. And even with the limited engagement that this game necessitates, I've rarely felt as engrossed or impacted by a work of art. So I was really excited when the studio announced their next project, Neva, looking to continue in color-rich storytelling. Neva immediately doesn't hold back the saturation. It's super saturated. There's this lineless style that I'm extremely fond of. All the detail is flattened, but through hue alone, it's able to distinguish without needing harsh lines to separate. It's also more intense. They've added a lot to this game in terms of combat and the fact that there's quite a bit of depth in what the wolf is doing with you. There's an empowerment in this game, allowing you to actually fight back. The story is very cognizant of time. As the wolf is constantly growing next to you, you are reminded of how far you've come, and your abilities reflect not so much your own progress, but the wolf's progress. Instead of grief, Neva pushes for a more explicit season metaphor. It's a lot less subtle in that it literally spells it out for you. That being seasonal is also cyclical in its resolution, leaving me with this strange dichotomy of feeling like resistance is expected, but leads to far less. Where Gris at least had an end point where I felt rewarded by the end, Neva made me feel as if I was back where I started. Both of these games clock in at about or under $20 pre-tax and run for between 4 and 5 hours depending on how much you like to aim for little extra bits. The addition of combat elements makes Neva more high input. However, based on my expectations, I mentioned I like fighting games. There are entire set pieces that feel like you are playing a fighting game, but if you fall off at all, there's very little you can do to get back, and I felt punished. If you have less fighting game experience, Neva is more easily recommendable. If you like being able to hit the things, Neva actually gives you that. Whereas in Gris, you are going to be only unlocking new abilities to solve puzzles. You're not really going to be fighting back. Presentation, I think Gris did better. I love the lineless style. I think the constant need for super high saturation wasn't implemented into the narrative nearly as much. You definitely get the sense of what season you are in, but Neva will overbloom the entire screen with no warning, leading to less visibility, whereas Gris being very constrained in the black to white, the values of the colors are constantly contrasting enough so that you can still see what you need to see in addition to quite a lot of outlines. I appreciated how much watercolor motion was implemented into so many animations, be it your own or just the world around you. Things really flow in Gris, and in Neva, despite having more animations and the enemies having some of that design language carried over, there was much less story impact as in Gris. If you, like me, are extremely excited and motivated by the visual design and direction of these games, play them. They're still two definitely amazing games. That being said, I will end up recommending Gris more often because the story, I think, has a stronger message and moment. If you have a stronger emotional bond with animals or the seasons as a concept, I think you would love Neva. but I recognize grief more than I recognize idealized seasons. And I find that overcoming grief, or dealing with, living with, getting past grief, is a lot more important to me. I really appreciated how stripped bare Gris was, how it said, I am this gorgeous painting that will let you into my world and transform me, and we will come out of this better. Whereas Neva, I felt like I was in a very pretty world where it felt like I was doing things, but the magnitude felt overblown to what it actually felt like I was doing. But hey, more important than what I think is what you think. I think Neva has a very strong argument for being a story not about you, and that might have just missed due to all my little frustrations. How do you go about telling people to play a game you feel a little less super impassioned about? I do want to talk to people about both of these games in equal measure, despite being way more glowing about one of them. I think they're both really worth it, worth the time. This proves that I can't really break these down into a rating system because they appeal to people for different reasons, and I couldn't rank one higher or lower than the other, realizing that I think they're both so valuable as art. It'd be rude to measure them like that. If you enjoyed this, I think you would also enjoy the book that I cited a couple times there at the front, Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. Quick warning, the author is very upfront with her severe depression. Know that before reading some potentially depressing stuff. But it is ultimately a very hopeful book.